In some previous videos, we looked at economic principles of ownership. Now we're going to apply those principles to some key examples. The first example to look at is infrastructure. If you haven't seen the previous videos outlining the economic principles of ownership, this will not make much sense. So I recommend going back and watching that video or watching it after this and coming back, because the content in this video relies a great deal on what was explained in the previous videos. Infrastructure includes things like roads, bridges, rail lines, airports, train stations, shipping ports, electrical grids, these sorts of infrastructure systems. So water and sewerage systems, communication networks. These are all examples of natural monopolies, because it would be extremely inefficient to have multiple parallel but competing sets of this physical infrastructure. They also require huge costs in terms of resources and capital to create these networks, to create these infrastructure systems. This means that there's enormous barriers to entry to the industry, to the sector. Infrastructure such as transportation networks and water systems are necessary for physical survival because they move our food supplies and our drinking water. Our electrical grids power hospitals. So these kinds of infrastructure, we could consider them to be pretty essential. Infrastructure systems are used by basically everyone in society, even if it is sometimes indirect, but basically everyone uses the transportation systems, even if they don't have a car. They are still benefiting from the transportation system because their food is being brought to them by the infrastructure. There are enormous non-economic benefits from having well-functioning essential infrastructure systems. These are things like facilitating visits between family members, or maintaining community relationships and connections, or just maintaining your physical health and increasing life expectancy, or enabling people to pursue their own personal interests and hobbies. These are non-economic benefits that are very hard to measure and quantify. And the essential infrastructure that we're talking about make these possible, make these non-economic benefits possible. These types of infrastructure are also essential for things like national defense, which means they provide non-economic benefits. If we were to privatize this kind of essential infrastructure, it will introduce a lot of inequity, because they effectively will relegate poor members of society, the poor citizens, will have to use slower, busier, and less well-maintained infrastructure. For example, toll roads force poor people to use longer routes to get where they need to go, often through less safe public road detours that are not maybe as well maintained. It also forces the poor to take a longer route around. Instead of paying the toll, they have to go the long way around, and maybe that ends up costing more in the maintenance of their car. Maybe it increases the cost of their fuel or energy costs, or maybe it just costs them in more time. So these are externalized costs of having privatized infrastructure. Having privatized infrastructure means that areas with wealthy residents are going to be better served. They're going to, for example, end up with faster internet speeds. They're going to have better maintained roads and better access to key infrastructure. When publicly built infrastructure is sold off to private interests, the motivation of those private interests is to maximize their financial or economic profit. This will be achieved by avoiding maintenance on the infrastructure to maximize their profits. Private enterprises are not going to be interested in the non-economic benefits, such as having clean drinking water or safe bridges and easy access to mass transit. As long as those private enterprises are making profits, these are secondary concerns for them that don't motivate them. Of course, there will be government regulations, and there's all kinds of government enforcement mechanisms in place, but that, in a way, is kind of the problem. Private ownership of essential infrastructure is not actually as efficient as private enterprises will have us believe, because private enterprises are motivated to maximize profit, reduce maintenance on the infrastructure that they're responsible for to an absolute minimum so that they can maximize profits, and only with massive amounts of government oversight do they do what they're supposed to do. And so the inefficiencies are externalized. The costs are externalized. Taxpayers pay for that government oversight, while the profit is privately generated. So profits are privatized and the benefits are privatized, but the true costs are externalized for taxpayers, as regulatory agencies have to be funded by taxpayers. But without those regulatory agencies, the essential infrastructure would deteriorate, or the costs for accessing it would skyrocket. Essential infrastructure has to be heavily regulated. That regulation is very expensive, and that's paid for by taxpayers. So private enterprises make enormous profits off the infrastructure, and the public is left spending lots of money to make sure that the private enterprises don't exploit that infrastructure they control. So privatized essential infrastructure is a very bad idea. If we use the ownership principles to look at essential infrastructure, then we can clearly see that all the principles point in the direction that essential infrastructure like roads and waters and electrical grids should be publicly owned for the benefit of all citizens. We really must be clear that private ownership of essential infrastructure must not be permitted. It produces bad outcomes for society. It doesn't make sense for anyone except for the owners of the monopoly infrastructure. So applying the 5 principles of ownership, we can draw the conclusion that essential infrastructure should be publicly owned in society when we use these principles to analyze what kind of ownership should happen in these natural monopoly essential infrastructure systems.